Yitz, how are his words so important?
Indeed, we start every day with them.
So this week, Parshat Balak, we find the famous story of Balak calling over Bila'am to come curse Am Yisrael, to help him try to feed Am Yisrael because he's so scared after he hears what happens to Sichon. And we all know what happens. Bila'am ends up blessing Am Yisrael, giving the brachos to Am Yisrael instead of cursing them. And as you mentioned, we actually start off our davening with these blessings of Bila'am. And the big question about this is, first of all, how did this end up being part of our davening? Why did we start a davening with this? And even more so, the Gmara actually suggests that we should say this whole parasha every single day. And if it wouldn't have been so long, we probably would have said this every day. What is so unique and special about these brachos that we give them so much place in our tradition? But even more so, put aside these brachos, look at who's giving them. Look at Bila'am. Bila'am is one of the biggest Rishayim we have in our tradition. One of the more evil people, one of the more wicked people that we have in our history. Gmara says that there's no end to the bad things you can say about Bila'am. So if he's such a bad person, why do we take his brachos? Usually if you want a bracha, you go to tzaddik, you go to somebody righteous, you go to a rabbi or someone like that. You don't go to somebody who's like Bila'am or Rasha. So how did these psukim, how did these Parsha of Bila'am become such an important part in our tradition, in our life?
That's very interesting, and actually an interesting comparison the Gmara makes between Sifro Shel Moshe, basically talking about the rest of Torah, and Parashat Bila'am, saying that both of them, as well as Eov, were written by Moshe. It's an interesting comparison between the two. We would usually see it as part of them. If we think about what makes Sifro Shel Moshe, what makes the book of Moshe Rabbeinu different than all other Sfarim, than all other Nevi'im, we treat it differently. We respect all of Tanakh, but there's a special place we have for psukim in the Torah. And the difference is that we treat them as if they're not coming from the Navi, coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We treat them as coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly. And although all Nevuot are HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaking to the Navi and the Navi giving it over, with Moshe's Nevuah, with Torah, we see it differently. Moshe received the Torah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We see every word coming out of Moshe as coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as if Moshe isn't even there, as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking to us directly. And this has to do partially with the uniqueness of the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. As the Torah describes Moshe as being the most humble of all, and as Chazal say, the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu is aspaklaria meira. It's like a clear glass, it's like a shining glass, as opposed to a window that's a bit dirty, a bit rusty, a bit dusty. I see what's behind it, but I don't see it clearly. That's usually how the Nevi'im see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But by Moshe Rabbeinu, it's direct, it's clear. And Moshe Rabbeinu, because he was so humble, he didn't get in the way. When things came from him, it's as if he wasn't even there. He just passed them directly on because he was the most humble of all. So even when it was coming through his mouth, because of this uniqueness of Moshe, we see it as coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu without anything in the way. And it's funny because that's exactly what's happening here, but the other way around. Bila'am Arasha, we know, is the exact opposite. Ruach Gvoha, Nefesh Rechava, as the Mishnah says, he was full of himself. But the funny thing here is he had no intention to say that bracha. He had no intentional involvement in anything that had to do with that bracha. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu, that bracha just came out of his mouth. So Moshe Rabbeinu intentionally put himself aside and let that bracha come out. But Bila'am Arasha, who wanted to do something else and ended up doing the exact opposite of what he wanted, by him too, that bracha is pure. It's pure in the sense that there was no human involvement almost. He wasn't part of this. He had the opposite intention. He was just a vessel where it came through, and it came through without any human intervention. Because of that, it's pure, it's greater, it's coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, regardless of what was the mouth that was actually opening up and saying it. And I think this is an important message in general, because we tend to give more value to the things we intentionally do, to the things we actively do. Sometimes people, when things happen by luck, even then they try to give some reasoning behind it, how they planned that to happen, because the assumption is if it's just luck, then that's not worth anything. It has to be something that I intended to do, that I worked for, that I built, that I did. And that's all true and nice, and it's good to do things. But sometimes the greatest things, those greatest moments, come from those things that we didn't plan, that we just found ourselves in, that somehow came out of our mouth. Those moments, instead of trying to hide them and push them away and cover them up with some, excuse of how you actually intended. The opposite. Grab those moments. Realize that those moments sometimes have great potential if you just open your eyes and recognize them, and recognize that sometimes those moments can be even purer and greater than all your intended intentions, and they can sometimes lift you even further and higher than anything else.
Wonderful. I like what you're saying, how by Bila'am not having any control about what he says, actually the most pure things came out without no intervention, without anything holding him back. And it's interesting because we know that many times in life we find ourselves needing to give a compliment to someone, and we actually sometimes have to hold ourselves back. First of all, because we don't feel so comfortable giving compliments to other people, maybe because our ego for other reasons, but also because there's a Gmara that meaning that you only say part of the praise in front of a person. As to funeral and a spading, when somebody dies, then that's when we say all the good things about the person. But when you meet a person, or when you're introducing someone, or when you're talking about a person in front of him, you only say part of the praise and you don't say all the praise. And there's a few reasons for that. First reason Rashi brings down right in the Gmara over there is because of Chanufa, that you shouldn't say all the praise in front of a person, because then it might look like you're trying to win that person's approval. You're trying to look good in the eyes of that person in order to get something from that person, which is borderline hypocrisy, or maybe even hypocrisy, when you talk so nicely about a person just in order to get something out of that person. And the second reason, which the Parsha brings, is actually because the person himself you're talking about. Because once he gets all the praise, that person himself might think to himself he's worth so much, and he might himself become a Balgaiva. He might himself become full of himself to think that he is worth so much and he has so much to his name, and then he can start mistreating others and misbehaving and seeing himself as so worthy. And really, we know from the Midrash, actually, that's what happened to Am Yisrael, because the Midrash tells us that right after these brachos, the reason Am Yisrael came to that place where they sinned in Chet Bar Pil was because they heard these incredible brachos from Bila'am, and they said to themselves, look at us, we're so great. They let it go to their heads, and they thought to themselves they can't sin anymore, which is very different from the brachos that we find by Yaakov giving the Shvatim, or by Moshe giving the Shvatim at the end of the Torah, because both of them, Yaakov and Moshe, added in some musar, added in some tochacha, added in some telling off to Am Yisrael before they gave the brachos, in order to put them in a place so that they don't feel so comfortable with themselves, so they don't think to themselves that they're all that they're so worthy of everything. And really what happened with Bila'am was that because he wanted to curse, and sometimes in life, when you want to curse somebody, that's already going over the line, and then there is no line. And we know this from many situations. When somebody curses, they just let it rip. They just let it all out. They don't put any borders to those kind of words. And if you flip it 180 degrees to the opposite, then you get a bracha with no boundaries. And really, that's what happened to Bila'am, which was a bracha with no tochacha, without telling Am Yisrael off. And this is also what makes it so special. And sometimes, we know, as we mentioned in the past, we need somebody in the outside to remind us how good we are. And you think about the past few months we had, especially with the operation that went on a month ago here in Israel, and you look at the global media, the best video clips that are always being shared on the WhatsApp and between people is dafka the people from the outside saying how great we are and supporting us and saying what amazing things Tzal does and how amazing it is to be part of our nation, because it is hard sometimes to recognize those things from the inside, and we do need somebody on the outside. And maybe really that's the reason why, on the one hand, these brachas are so important, because we need somebody on the outside to remind us of how life here is great and how life by us is great. However, on the other side, we shouldn't let it go to our minds. We shouldn't think to ourselves too much because of these brachas, because we still have what to fix, we still have what to do, we still have what to correct, and we still have a long way to go in order to bring the redemption to the world.
It's interesting you mentioned the bracha of Yaakov Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu, because actually the bracha that Yaakov receives is somewhat similar, because there was no intention there either. And the Midrash actually says something very interesting. It says that there are three things that are in your hands, which are your hands, your feet, and your mouth. You control what you say, you control where you walk, you control what you do with your hands, and there are three that are not in your hand. What is that? That is your eyes. You see sometimes things you don't want. You hear sometimes things you don't want. You smell sometimes things you don't want. But the Midrash ends, when you're zocha, you sometimes merit that even those things that are in your hands are taken away from you, are not in your hands. And this doesn't seem like a merit. It seems like a negative thing. Something is taken away from you. But the Midrash ends with the pasuk that Yitzchak says, when he suddenly finds out and he's shocked, Yaakov stole the bracha and it wasn't what he intended. He thought he was giving the bracha to Esav and it ended up being to Yaakov. And instead of going, oh my God, then let's cancel this, let's turn it around, he ends with three words, Gam Baruch Yeh, blessed he will be. And the Midrash says that, meaning that Yitzchak at that moment recognized, you know what, this isn't what I intended, but maybe what I intended was wrong. I was zocha, I had the merit that something happened here beyond my intention, that maybe this is a greater purpose than I thought. I thought I should be giving the bracha to Esav, but things turned out differently. Instead of fighting and getting frustrated meditated about that, he recognizes and says, this is actually something greater than me. Maybe actually the bracha should go to Yaakov, and he ends Gam Baruch Yeh. And these two go together. As you were saying, sometimes the bracha coming from an outside source recognizes things that we don't see on the inside, but also sometimes the bracha coming from the outside in the sense that it's not what I intended. It came from somewhere else. It came from a different place. Also brings something that I couldn't bring myself. And this makes these brachot so unique and so special that we hold on to them and say them every day in our tefillah.
Beautiful, beautiful. And if you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to comment, like the videos, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Thank you, Yitzi.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Tzom Kal on Sunday, and Emet Hashem, we'll talk again next week. For more Talking Torah videos on different topics, check out our YouTube channel.